The morning was crisp, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter and quicken your step. A young couple strolled along the quiet path near a New Brunswick farm, chatting lightly as the sun rose over the fields. It was supposed to be just another peaceful Saturday morning, but what they found changed everything. Beneath a gnarled crabapple tree, partially cloaked in the shadow of its branches, lay two lifeless bodies. Reverend Edward Hall, a man of faith and prominence in the community, was sprawled out on his back, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. A gunshot wound marred his temple, but his expression was eerily serene. Beside him was Eleanor Mills, the choir singer whose voice had enchanted so many in their small town. But now her voice was silenced forever. Her throat was slashed so savagely it was almost severed. And then there were the clues details that sent an immediate shiver down the spine of anyone who heard them. Torn love letters, scattered like confessions to the wind, surrounded the pair. Reverend Hall's calling card sat deliberately at his feet, as though someone wanted to ensure his identity was known. Eleanor's body was positioned unnervingly close to his, her skirt pulled up in a humiliating display. The scene was intimate, deliberate, and hauntingly quiet. It spoke of passion, betrayal, and something much darker, a story waiting to be unearthed. The police were called, but even their arrival did little to bring order to the chaos. By the time they reached the site, curious locals had already trampled through the scene, destroying critical evidence. What remained were questions, suspicions, and a growing sense that this was no ordinary crime. Who killed the reverend and the choir singer? And why leave behind such personal and chilling clues? The answers would unravel a scandal far larger than anyone could have imagined. Reverend Edward Hall was not just a man of the cloth. He was a symbol of moral integrity and spiritual guidance in the small community of New Brunswick, New Jersey. As the leader of the Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist, he had a polished reputation and a warm demeanor that made him beloved among his parishioners. But beneath the Reverend's composed exterior lay a secret that would shock his congregation to its core. Eleanor Mills, a choir singer at the same church, was a woman of modest means and magnetic charm. Her voice, said to be angelic, often filled the church with hymns that moved even the coldest hearts. Eleanor was married to James Mills, a local janitor. Their life was simple, but Eleanor's aspirations reached beyond the confines of their modest home. Her letters to Reverend Hall, later discovered at the crime scene, painted the picture of a woman longing for something more, something forbidden. Reverend Hall, on the other hand, was married to Frances Noel Stevens Hall, a wealthy woman from a prominent family. Frances' social standing and the influence of her family meant that Reverend Hall lived a life of privilege and comfort. But privilege didn't shield him from temptation. The revelation of Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills' affair sent ripples of scandal through their community. The letters found near their bodies confirmed what had only been whispered in hushed tones. The Reverend and the choir singer were deeply involved, emotionally and physically. Eleanor's words, brimming with passion, revealed her dream of a life with Hall, away from the constraints of their current lives. But for Hall, the affair was far more complicated. Bound by his marriage and his position in the church, he was living a double life that would soon catch up with him. This wasn't just a case of two lovers caught in a dangerous liaison. It was a betrayal that threatened reputations, marriages, and the sanctity of a religious community. And as whispers grew louder, so did the suspicion that someone close to the victims might have wanted them silenced permanently. Who stood to lose the most from the affair being exposed? Was it a jealous spouse, a disgraced family, or someone entirely unexpected? With this scandal out in the open, the stage was set for an investigation that would turn this quiet town upside down. The scene under the crabapple tree was as haunting as it was deliberate, its every detail pointing to a story of passion turned to violence. The bodies of Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were not just left to be found, they were arranged as if to send a message. Reverend Hall lay on his back, his body stretched out, his hand lightly grazing the grass. A single gunshot wound to his head had ended his life, but there was no sign of a struggle. His face bore an oddly peaceful expression, as though he had seen his fate coming. His glasses, remarkably intact, sat askew on his nose, adding an eerie normalcy to the otherwise brutal scene. Eleanor Mills, in stark contrast, had suffered a far more violent end. She was positioned beside him, her head resting on his outstretched arm as if in a macabre imitation of an embrace. But the violence done to her told a different story. She had been shot 3 times, and her throat was slashed so deeply that her head was nearly severed. Her face, once animated with the vibrancy of her choir performances, was now frozen in a lifeless stare. Scattered around the couple were torn fragments of love letters, their passionate words now exposed to the world. Some were smeared with blood, others damp from the morning dew. It was as if the killer wanted to ensure no one could miss the implication of their affair, a public unveiling of their secret romance, even in death. The details of the crime scene spoke volumes about the nature of the murder. Hall's single gunshot suggested he was a secondary target, silenced swiftly. Eleanor's brutal injuries, however, screamed of rage, hatred, and perhaps jealousy. The deliberate positioning of her body, her skirt pulled up, exposing her legs, added a cruel layer of humiliation. Someone had wanted to shame her, even in death. For investigators, the scene was a puzzle of emotions, love, betrayal, and fury intertwined. The precision of Hall's death and the savagery of Eleanor's hinted at a deeply personal motive. But whose rage was it? A jealous spouse? A spurned lover? Or someone else entirely, someone whose motivations lay hidden beneath layers of deceit? As the authorities began to piece together the story, one thing became clear. This was not the work of a random killer. The positioning of the bodies, the presence of the letters, and the grotesque symbolism all pointed to someone with a deep and personal connection to the victims. The crime was not just a murder, it was a statement. But what exactly was the killer trying to say? As word of the grim discovery spread, the quiet farmland of New Brunswick became a spectacle. Crowds of curious onlookers swarmed the scene, trampling through the grass, pocketing fragments of torn love letters, and even removing stray personal items. Reporters, eager to get the story, arrived en masse, their cameras clicking incessantly. By the time authorities arrived, the crime scene was in shambles, and crucial evidence had been irreparably compromised. Despite the chaos, investigators began reconstructing the victim's final hours. Reverend Edward Hall had last been seen leaving his home the previous evening, saying he had church matters to attend to. Eleanor Mills, who lived not far from the church, had told her husband James that she planned to visit a sick friend. Neither ever returned home. What drew Hall and Mills to the secluded area beneath the crabapple tree that night? Was it a planned rendezvous, a romantic escape hidden from prying eyes? Or were they lured there under false pretenses by someone with far darker intentions? Investigators immediately turned their focus to the torn love letters scattered at the scene. Though fragmented, their contents were damning. The letters spoke of longing, passion, and a shared dream of a life free from their respective spouses. In one, Eleanor called Hall her true love, lamenting their inability to be together. The letters painted a vivid picture of the affair that had been whispered about for years, but never publicly confirmed until now. But the investigators weren't just following the trail of love and betrayal. They also began digging into potential suspects. The brutality of the crime, especially Eleanor's injuries, pointed to a deep personal anger. This wasn't the work of a stranger or a random act of violence. Someone close to Hall and Mills had a motive to kill. Suspicion fell on Frances Noel Stevens Hall, Edward's wife. Known for her fiery temper and strong-willed personality, Frances had every reason to want her husband's infidelity silenced. But she wasn't alone in the spotlight. Frances' brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, also became persons of interest. Both were fiercely protective of their sister, and Willie, in particular, was known for his erratic behavior. The question now was clear. Had jealousy and rage driven someone to murder? Or was there another force at play, one that investigators had yet to uncover? With the evidence muddied and the town's gossip running wild, authorities faced an uphill battle. They had fragments of a story, but the full picture remained frustratingly elusive. In the swirling chaos of the investigation, one voice emerged from the shadows, a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the truth, or at least a version of it. Jane Gibson, a pig farmer who lived near the crime scene, became an unlikely witness in the Hall Mills murder case. Her dramatic and peculiar testimony would ignite as much intrigue as the crime itself. Jane, soon nicknamed the Pig Woman by the press, claimed she had seen everything on the night of the murders. She painted a vivid picture for investigators, a shadowy confrontation beneath the crabapple tree. According to her, she was in her fields tending to her livestock when she heard raised voices in the distance. Curious, she moved closer, keeping to the cover of the darkness. What she described next was chilling. She claimed she saw four figures standing under the moonlight, two men and two women. The argument was heated, with one woman's voice ringing out above the others, shouting, "Explain these letters!" Then came the gunshots, sharp cracks that echoed through the night. Jane said she saw the figures scatter, leaving the two bodies behind. Her account seemed almost too perfect, a convenient puzzle piece that could tie the case together. But there were problems. When pressed for details, her story began to shift in subtle yet critical ways. The timeline of events became muddled, the descriptions of the figures under the tree vague. Some investigators believed she had seen something, perhaps figures in the distance, or heard the gunshots, but others accused her of embellishing the truth for attention. To complicate matters, Jane Gibson was an eccentric character, the kind of person the townsfolk had always regarded with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Her reputation as a storyteller and her outlandish demeanor cast doubt on her credibility. Defense attorneys latched onto this, tearing her testimony apart in court. Was she a key eyewitness or just a pig farmer looking for her moment in the spotlight? Despite the inconsistencies, Jane's testimony added an eerie layer to the case. If her account was even partially true, it suggested that the murders were no crime of opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated act carried out in the presence of more than one person. Could it have been Frances Hall and her brothers, as many speculated? Or were the figures Jane claimed to see part of an entirely different web of intrigue? The pig woman's testimony became a spectacle in its own right, both riveting and divisive. It left the public captivated, but no closer to the truth. And as the trial loomed, her story would prove both a weapon and a liability in the battle to solve one of America's most infamous mysteries. As investigators delved deeper into the lives of those closest to the victims, suspicion inevitably turned toward Frances Noel Stevens Hall, the widow of Reverend Edward Hall. Frances, a woman of wealth and social prominence, had built a life centered around her family's reputation and power. But now that carefully constructed world was crumbling, and whispers of her involvement in the murders grew louder with each passing day. Frances had always been known as a strong-willed woman, deeply protective of her social standing. Her marriage to Reverend Hall, though seemingly stable on the surface, had long been a topic of quiet speculation. Those who knew the couple described a union that was more pragmatic than romantic, a partnership of convenience rather than love. When the affair between Edward and Eleanor Mills came to light, it wasn't just a betrayal of their vows, it was a humiliation that Frances would never tolerate. Complicating matters were Frances' two brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens. The Stevens brothers were an unusual pair, fiercely loyal to their sister and unapologetically brash. Henry, the elder, was known for his sharp wit and commanding presence, while Willie, described by many as eccentric, had a reputation for erratic behavior and explosive temper. Together, they formed a protective shield around Frances, their family bond unbreakable. Rumors swirled that Frances had discovered the affair and enlisted her brothers to help her confront Edward. Could their righteous anger over the scandal have boiled over into violence? Witnesses recalled seeing Frances' car near the scene on the night of the murders, and the testimony of Jane Gibson, the pig woman, only added fuel to the fire. Her description of four figures beneath the crabapple tree, a detail she adamantly repeated, aligned with the theory that Frances and her brothers were involved. The Stevens family, however, denied everything. Frances maintained her composure in public, presenting herself as a grieving widow unjustly accused of a heinous crime. Her brothers, too, remained defiant, their lawyers dismissing the allegations as baseless gossip. Yet their behavior only deepened the public's suspicions. Willie, in particular, seemed unable to avoid scrutiny, his erratic demeanor drawing unwanted attention during questioning. For many, the motive was clear: jealousy, humiliation, and the desire to preserve the family's honor. But was there enough evidence to prove their guilt? The case against Frances and her brothers was compelling, but it was also circumstantial. No weapon was ever found, and the lack of reliable forensic techniques in the 1920s meant that physical evidence was limited. The widow and her brothers stood at the center of a swirling storm of suspicion, their every move scrutinized by both investigators and the public. But were they truly the architects of the crime, or convenient scapegoats for a scandalous murder that defied easy answers? As the case unfolded, it became clear that the truth was as elusive as ever, and the shadows surrounding the Stevens family only grew darker. 4 years after the murders of Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, the wheels of justice began to turn slowly, dramatically, and under the intense glare of public scrutiny. In 1926, Frances Noel Stevens Hall and her brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, were officially charged and brought to trial for the crime that had shocked the nation. The trial would become one of the most sensational spectacles of its time. From the outset, the courtroom was a circus. Journalists from across the country descended upon New Brunswick, turning the trial into a media frenzy. Newspapers competed to outdo one another with lurid headlines, painting Frances as a jealous widow and her brothers as violent enforcers of family honor. The courtroom itself became a theater, with every testimony and cross-examination playing out like a gripping drama for the packed audience of onlookers. The prosecution presented its case with a mix of circumstantial evidence and dramatic witnesses. Jane Gibson, the pig woman, was the star attraction. In a move that highlighted the theatrical nature of the trial, Gibson was wheeled into the courtroom on a hospital bed. Pale and visibly unwell, she recounted her chilling testimony once again, claiming she had witnessed the murders and overheard a heated argument under the crabapple tree. But her story, as dramatic as it was, did not go unchallenged. The defense attorneys pounced on her inconsistencies, pointing out discrepancies in her accounts over the years. They painted her as an unreliable witness, a woman eager for attention and willing to embellish the truth. Her credibility crumbled under the scrutiny, leaving the jury and the public questioning the weight of her testimony. The defense also capitalized on the lack of hard evidence. No murder weapon had been recovered, and the prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial details, such as the positioning of the bodies, the torn love letters, and Frances Hall's alleged jealousy. The Stevens brothers, though eccentric, vehemently denied any involvement, and their legal team worked tirelessly to cast doubt on the entire case. Frances herself became a focal point of the trial. Dressed in black and projecting the image of a grieving widow, she maintained her composure throughout the proceedings. Her calm demeanor and steadfast declarations of innocence divided public opinion. Was she a heartbroken woman unjustly accused, or a cold, calculating killer hiding behind a veneer of respectability? As the trial dragged on, the spectacle overshadowed the substance. The jury deliberated for hours, sifting through the tangled web of testimonies and theories. In the end, Frances Hall and her brothers were acquitted. The prosecution's case was simply too thin, its evidence too circumstantial to secure a conviction. The verdict shocked the public, leaving the question of who killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills unanswered. The trial, though it failed to deliver justice, cemented the Hall-Mills murders as one of America's most enduring mysteries. It was a story of love, betrayal, and murder that had captivated a nation and left behind a legacy of questions that would never be fully resolved. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the verdict was read: not guilty. Frances Hall and her brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, walked free, leaving behind a trial that had captivated the nation but delivered no justice for Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. The acquittal came as a crushing blow to the prosecution, who had gambled on the emotional weight of their case rather than hard evidence. For the public, it was a moment of collective disbelief. The Stevens family left the courthouse triumphant yet shadowed by suspicion. Though legally exonerated, the whispers of their alleged guilt persisted. For Frances, the trial had been a public crucible, her every action scrutinized and her reputation forever tarnished. Yet she maintained her innocence to the end, portraying herself as a grieving widow caught in a web of lies and scandal. The aftermath of the trial was as chaotic as the investigation itself. The public was bitterly divided. Some believed the acquittal was a miscarriage of justice, a result of wealth and influence shielding the guilty. Others argued the case had been built on shaky ground from the start, with unreliable witnesses and circumstantial evidence that failed to hold up in court. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought no closure. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, faded into obscurity, his grief compounded by public judgment over his wife's affair. Frances Hall, though free, retreated from public life, her name forever tied to the gruesome murders. Willie Stevens, eccentric and volatile, remained a figure of curiosity, with many wondering if his peculiarities masked a darker truth. As for the crime itself, it became one of America's most infamous cold cases. Theories continued to swirl. Was it truly an act of jealousy and rage? Could the Stevens family have orchestrated the murders and manipulated their way to freedom? Or was the real killer someone entirely unknown, their identity lost to history? The unanswered questions ensured the Hall Mills murders remained etched in the public consciousness. Books, articles, and debates kept the mystery alive, with amateur sleuths attempting to solve the case long after it had gone cold. Yet, despite decades of speculation, no new evidence ever emerged, and the truth of what happened beneath the crabapple tree on that September night in 1922 remains shrouded in mystery. The verdict may have closed the chapter on Frances Hall and her brothers, but the story of the Hall Mills murders lives on a haunting reminder of love, betrayal, and the elusive nature of justice. The Hall Mills murder case became a media spectacle of unprecedented scale. At a time when sensational journalism was on the rise, the case provided the perfect storm of scandal, mystery, and drama to capture national attention. Newspapers across the country splashed lurid headlines about the crabapple murders on their front pages, weaving the details of the crime into stories that were equal parts fact and fiction. Journalists swarmed New Brunswick, New Jersey, turning the quiet town into the epicenter of a media circus. Reporters clamored for access to witnesses, crime scene photos, and any scraps of gossip they could find. The involvement of Jane Gibson, the eccentric pig woman, only added to the spectacle. Her theatrical testimony was dissected and exaggerated in columns that blurred the line between reporting and storytelling. The case set a new precedent for the role of the media in high-profile trials. Instead of simply informing the public, newspapers drove the narrative, often crafting their own theories and framing suspects in ways that would sell more papers. Frances Hall and her brothers were vilified in some publications and portrayed as victims of persecution in others. The trial became less about justice and more about entertainment, with the media playing judge and jury in the court of public opinion. This level of coverage left a lasting legacy. The Hall Mills case was among the first to demonstrate the power of the press to shape public perception of criminal cases, a phenomenon that would continue to influence high-profile trials for decades to come. It also highlighted the dangers of sensationalism, as crucial facts were often lost in the frenzy of headlines and speculation. Despite the media attention, the courtroom drama, and years of speculation, the Hall Mills murders remain an enigma. At its core are questions that have haunted investigators and the public alike for over a century. Who truly had the motive and the opportunity to kill Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills? The nature of the crime, brutal yet deliberate, suggested a deep personal rage. Was it Frances Hall, driven by jealousy and humiliation, or her brothers acting to protect their sister's honor and reputation? And if not them, then who? The positioning of the bodies added another layer of mystery. Why were they arranged so deliberately under the crabapple tree, with the love letters scattered like confessions? Was it a symbolic act meant to expose their affair, or a taunt from the killer daring investigators to uncover the truth? Perhaps the most chilling question is this: could the real killer have been someone entirely overlooked, their identity hidden by the chaos of the investigation? With the crime scene compromised and key evidence lost or ignored, it's impossible to say what clues were missed in the early days of the case. The lack of definitive answers has kept the Hall Mills murders alive in the public imagination. It's a story that refuses to fade, its haunting questions echoing through time. And as the years pass, the truth seems to slip further out of reach, leaving behind only speculation, suspicion, and a mystery that may never be solved. Among the haunting details of the crime scene, none stood out more than the torn fragments of love letters scattered around the bodies of Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. These letters, written in Eleanor's passionate handwriting, revealed an intimate relationship that had long been the subject of hushed whispers. They spoke of forbidden love, secret rendezvous, and a longing to escape the confines of their respective marriages. One letter fragment found near Elena read, "Sweetheart, my true love, I long for you as the flowers long for the sun." Such poetic declarations made it clear that the bond between the two was far more than a fleeting affair. It was an emotional entanglement that Eleanor, at least, hoped would lead to a new life together. For Hall, the affair may have been equally meaningful, but his commitments as a husband and clergyman made their union impossible. The presence of these letters at the scene raised critical questions. Were they placed there deliberately by the killer as a statement of betrayal, exposing the affair for the world to see? Or were they simply Eleanor's possessions, ripped apart in a fit of rage during a confrontation? Either way, the letters transformed the murders into more than a crime. They became a public scandal, dragging personal relationships into the harsh light of scrutiny and adding fuel to the theory that jealousy or betrayal was at the heart of the crime. The Hall Mills investigation was profoundly hindered by the forensic limitations of the 1920s. In an era long before DNA testing, advanced ballistics, or even reliable fingerprint analysis, investigators were left with little more than their instincts and rudimentary tools to solve the crime. The lack of crime scene preservation compounded the challenges. With onlookers trampling through the area and tampering with evidence, crucial clues were lost before the investigation could even begin. Fragments of the torn love letters were pocketed as souvenirs, footprints were obliterated, and potential witnesses left the scene before being questioned. Had the crime occurred in modern times, forensic science might have provided the answers that eluded investigators. Ballistic analysis could have determined the type of weapon used and traced it to its owner. DNA evidence might have identified who had touched the love letters or the victims. Even something as basic as luminol could have revealed blood trails, pointing to where the crime had begun or where the bodies had been moved from. Instead, the investigation relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and testimonies, many of which were unreliable or tainted by personal bias. The limitations of the era left the case shrouded in ambiguity, with critical questions unanswered and the truth slipping further out of reach. When news of the Hall Mills murders broke, it sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of New Brunswick. The brutal nature of the killings and the scandalous revelation of the victim's affair created a maelstrom of outrage, gossip, and fascination. To many, the affair between Reverend Hall, a man of God, and Eleanor Mills, a married choir singer, was not just immoral, but an unforgivable betrayal of their trust. The brutality of Eleanor's murder, in particular, horrified the public. Her slashed throat and the deliberate exposure of her body were seen as acts of profound cruelty, sparking speculation about the killer's motives. Was it an act of personal vengeance, or was someone trying to send a broader message? The affair dominated conversations in the town, with theories spreading like wildfire. Frances Hall, Edward's widow, became a prime target of suspicion, as did her brothers Henry and Willie Stevens. But others speculated about the involvement of unknown parties, jealous lovers, disgruntled parishioners, or even Eleanor's own husband, James Mills. The scandal also extended beyond the crime itself. The press coverage, rife with sensationalism, amplified the public's fascination. People who had never heard of New Brunswick before now followed every detail, dissecting the affair and the crime as though it were a piece of lurid fiction. For the families of the victims, the public reaction was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the attention kept pressure on authorities to solve the case. On the other, the relentless gossip and judgment turned their private grief into a spectacle, ensuring they would never escape the shadow of the murders. The community's collective shock and speculation transformed the Hall Mills case into an enduring symbol of scandal, betrayal, and unanswered questions. While the Stevens family remained the primary suspects in the eyes of many, alternative theories have persisted over the years. Some pointed fingers at disgruntled parishioners of Reverend Hall's church, individuals who may have felt betrayed or outraged by his moral failings. The revelation of his affair with Eleanor Mills not only tarnished his reputation, but also shook the faith of those who had looked up to him as a spiritual leader. Could one of these disillusioned parishioners have taken matters into their own hands, seeking to punish Hall for his transgressions? Others speculated about the involvement of unknown lovers. Eleanor, known for her charm and outgoing nature, might have attracted the attention of someone who couldn't bear the thought of her affection for Reverend Hall. Alternatively, could a spurned admirer of Reverend Hall have acted out of jealousy? Another theory suggests the possibility of an entirely separate agenda, an opportunistic crime, where the affair was simply a convenient scapegoat. The dramatic staging of the bodies and the scattered love letters might have been an attempt to mislead investigators and mask the true motive. Despite these theories, none have been substantiated by concrete evidence. The crime remains a puzzle with missing pieces, leaving room for endless speculation about the identities and motivations of those involved. The Hall Mills murders have endured as one of America's most perplexing unsolved mysteries. At its core, the case is more than just a tale of scandal and violence. It's a window into the complexities of human relationships, jealousy, and betrayal. The story of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills speaks to the darker side of passion, where love and devotion can become entangled with obsession and revenge. The case also serves as a reflection of its time, highlighting the limitations of early 20th century criminal investigations. The mishandling of evidence, the influence of public opinion, and the sensationalism of the media all played critical roles in shaping the case's trajectory. These elements, while fascinating, also underscore how the truth can be distorted or lost in the chaos of high-profile cases. Today, the Hall Mills murders remain a subject of fascination for amateur sleuths, historians, and true crime enthusiasts. The story has been immortalized in books, articles, and even local folklore, ensuring that the victims' names and the questions surrounding their deaths will not be forgotten. In the years since the murders, modern investigators and forensic experts have revisited the case, dissecting its flaws and what might have been done differently. One of the most glaring issues was the gross mishandling of the crime scene. The lack of proper preservation allowed evidence to be trampled, stolen, or destroyed, leaving investigators with a fragmented picture of what truly happened under the crabapple tree. Additionally, the overwhelming media attention significantly impacted the judicial process. Witnesses like Jane Gibson were turned into characters for public consumption, their testimonies both sensationalized and scrutinized to the point of absurdity. The trial itself became a theatrical event, overshadowing the search for facts with dramatics. Modern forensic science, had it been available, could have provided a wealth of information. DNA evidence might have identified the killer's presence on the love letters or the victims. Advanced ballistics could have traced the bullets to a specific weapon. Even modern psychological profiling might have offered insights into the killer's mindset. Yet, the case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of sensationalism, the fragility of evidence, and the importance of unbiased investigations. Revisiting the Hall Mills murders not only reminds us of the tragic lives lost, but also reveals how easily the quest for justice can be derailed by human error and public fervor. The Hall Mills murder case has etched itself into the annals of American true crime lore, inspiring countless books, articles, and discussions over the years. Its elements of scandal, betrayal, and grisly violence have made it a compelling tale for storytellers and a symbol of society's fascination with unsolved mysteries. From detailed investigative works to speculative fiction, the case continues to capture the imagination of those who seek to unravel its secrets. The murders have also served as a cautionary tale in the broader context of criminal justice and media ethics. The trial's theatrical nature and the media frenzy surrounding it are often referenced in discussions about the influence of public opinion on legal proceedings. The Hall Mills case not only remains a chilling whodunit, but also a mirror reflecting society's obsession with drama, scandal, and the search for truth. The Hall Mills murders stand as a stark reminder of how critical missteps can derail the pursuit of justice. The failure to secure the crime scene, allowing onlookers and reporters to compromise evidence, set the investigation back before it even began. The reliance on circumstantial evidence and unreliable testimonies highlighted the limitations of early 20th century forensic science and investigation techniques. The case also underscores the dangers of media sensationalism. The press, eager for a story, blurred the lines between fact and fiction, influencing public perception and possibly even the trial's outcome. The Hall Mills case demonstrates the need for careful, unbiased investigations free from external pressures, a lesson that remains relevant today. Decades later, the Hall Mills murders continue to spark debate among amateur sleuths, historians, and true crime enthusiasts. Each new theory, whether based on circumstantial evidence or creative speculation, breathes fresh life into the case. Online forums, podcasts, and documentaries revisit the murders, dissecting the crime scene, re-examining witness testimonies, and questioning the motives of the Stevens family and other potential suspects. Some researchers cling to the idea that Frances Hall and her brothers were guilty but escaped conviction due to insufficient evidence. Others suggest the possibility of an unknown perpetrator, their identity lost to history. With each new angle explored, the mystery grows deeper, ensuring that the case remains as intriguing now as it was in 1922. The Hall Mills murders remain a haunting enigma, a story of love, betrayal, and violence that defies resolution. Even a century later, the truth eludes us, buried beneath layers of rumor, scandal, and time. But perhaps with fresh eyes and open minds, the mystery can be unraveled. What do you think happened beneath the crabapple tree that fateful night? Could the Stevens family have carried out the crime, or was there another hand at work? Share your theories in the comments, and let's keep the conversation alive. Together, we may get closer to the answers that have evaded justice for so long. The Hall Mills case invites us not only to solve the puzzle, but to reflect on the enduring complexities of human nature, justice, and the search for truth. Stay curious, stay questioning, and perhaps one day the truth will finally come to light.